Chapter 1. The Wrong Staircase. The train that carried the new wolves to Northgate Academy did not run on iron rails. It ran on the backs of 6 shaggy draft elk, and it groaned up the mountain switchbacks so slowly that Olivia Ashworth had time to memorize every crack in the wooden bench before the fortress finally came into view. She had imagined it 100 times from her father's stories, back when he still told them. A keep of gray stones stitched into the spine of the mountains, its towers wrapped in cloud, its windows lit gold even at dusk like 100 watching eyes. The reality was worse and better than the stories. Worse, because the wind up here smelled of ice and pine sap and something colder underneath, something that made the hair on her arms rise before she understood it was the collective scent of hundreds of wolves who did not know her and did not want to. Better, because for one dizzy moment, looking up at those towers, she forgot she was afraid. 18 was the age. It had always been the age. Every wolf born beneath the old treaties was required to present themselves at Northgate the autumn after their 18th birthday, to be sorted, trained, and ranked before they were permitted to call themselves grown. It was not a school in the way the human towns down in the valley had schools. It was closer to a proving ground, a place where the pack decided, over the course of a single brutal year, exactly how much a person was worth. Olivia already knew her answer. She had known it since she was 9 years old, and her mother died, and the sympathy visits from the pack elders stopped arriving within the month, as though grief itself were a debt that had been called in and paid. She and her father lived on the western edge of the settlement, past the tanners and the grain stores, in the kind of house nobody visited unless they needed something fixed. Nobody ranked at 0, but close enough that it didn't matter. She had spent the whole climb rehearsing a version of herself that might survive the year ahead, quiet, competent, unremarkable, the kind of student no instructor bothered to single out and no highborn wolf bothered to resent. It was, she knew even as she built it in her head, a fragile kind of armor, but it was the only kind she had. Her father had pressed a small carved wolf into her palm before she left, worn smooth from being carried in her mother's coat pocket for years before that, and told her only, "Keep your head down and your eyes open," which was as close as he had ever come, in 9 years, to explaining what her mother had once warned him this place could be. The carriage let her off in a courtyard already churning with new arrivals. Wolves in fine traveling cloaks trailed by servants carrying their trunks. Wolves in plainer wool doing the carrying themselves. A woman with a clipboard and the flat, unhurried authority of someone who had done this every year for 2 decades called out names and assigned wings. When she reached the A, she said, without looking up, "Ashworth. West Stair, 4th landing, last door," and moved on before Olivia could ask where the West Stair was. She found out, eventually, that the placements were not random. Alpha blood families occupied the high floors, where the windows caught the morning sun and the servants delivered breakfast on trays. Everyone beneath them was arranged in careful descending order, rank by rank, bloodline by bloodline, until you reached the lower corridors where Olivia's door waited, half warped in its frame, at the very end of a hall that smelled permanently of damp stone. It was well past midnight by the time she'd hauled her single trunk up 4 flights, twice taking a wrong turn in corridors that all looked the same in the dark, twice retracing her steps past unfamiliar doors with unfamiliar names carved into brass plates. The Academy's architecture, she would learn, was not an accident. The maze of identical landings and doubling back stairwells was a kind of a first test, cruel and unannounced, designed to see which of the new wolves could find their footing and which would wander until dawn. Northgate had been built, according to the histories she would later be assigned to read, not by any single pack, but by an alliance of the old northern bloodlines nearly 3 centuries ago, back when the mountain passes still belonged to no one, and the wolves who claimed them had to prove, generation after generation, that they could survive the winters better than the packs on either side of them. The keep's builders had folded that old survivalist cruelty into the stones themselves. Every hallway curved instead of running straight. Every landing repeated itself just enough to unsettle a tired mind, and it was said that even instructors who had taught here for 20 years still occasionally lost themselves in the western wing after dark. It was meant, Olivia would come to understand, to be the first and gentlest of many lessons the mountain intended to teach her, that nothing here would be handed to her plainly, and that the ones who thrived were the ones who learned to read a place rather than simply move through it. She was wandering. The staircase she eventually climbed, thinking it was hers, was too narrow, its steps too worn in the center, as though generations of feet had climbed only this one flight and no other. She noticed too late that there were no other doors along the landing at its top, only one, broad and iron-bound, standing slightly ajar, light spilling from the gap in a thin gold line across the floor. She should have turned around. She would tell herself that 1,000 times over the following months. She should have turned around the moment she saw that there was only one door on this landing, because in a place organized as ruthlessly by rank as Northgate, only one kind of family got an entire floor to themselves. Instead, moving on legs gone heavy with exhaustion, she pushed the door open another inch, meaning only to check the number, and found herself standing at the threshold of a room the size of her family's entire house. The Alpha Heir's private wing. She understood this a half-second too late, in the same instant that the bathing room door at the far end opened and a wall of steam rolled out ahead of him, and Caleb Thornwood stepped into his own chamber, wearing nothing but a towel slung low across his hips and an expression of pure, startled fury. There was no polite way to think it, and Olivia was too tired and too frightened to find a polite way, beautiful in the manner of a drawn blade, all clean dark lines, black hair dripping rivulets down a chest, and stomach carved from the kind of training that came from a lifetime of being groomed to lead. Water slid off his shoulders and caught the lamplight. For one absurd, mortifying heartbeat, Olivia's brain simply stopped working, caught somewhere between animal alarm and something else entirely, something low and unfamiliar that she would spend weeks refusing to name. Then his eyes found her properly, and the fury sharpened into something colder. "Who let you in here?" It wasn't a question. His voice had the particular flatness of someone who had never once in his life had to ask permission to be angry. The stairs, I took the wrong stairs. I didn't know this was." She was already backing toward the door, face burning, painfully aware that she had just trespassed in the private quarters of the single most powerful 18-year-old in the Northern Pack, and that the punishment for this, for an unranked nobody, was rumored to be expulsion at best. He crossed the room in 3 strides, fast enough that instinct made her flinch, and she caught, underneath the anger, the precise moment his nostrils flared and his whole body went still. He did not touch her. He stopped an arm's length away and simply breathed, once, twice, his golden eyes narrowing not in fresh anger now but in something closer to confusion, like a man who has walked into a familiar room and found all the furniture rearranged. It was, Olivia thought wildly, the strangest thing she had ever witnessed, fury dissolving in real time into something far more careful, the set of his shoulders easing even as his brow stayed furrowed, as though his body had decided something his mind had not yet caught up to. She was suddenly, acutely aware of every detail of the room around her, the way fear sometimes sharpens the senses instead of dulling them. A fire banked low in a hearth twice the size of anything in her father's house. Shelves of old-bound volumes stacked along one wall, a training blade mounted above the mantel, the particular hush of a space built for someone who had never once had to share it. And underneath all of it, unmistakable even to her still untrained senses, the low warm scent of him, wood smoke and rain and something else she had no name for yet, filling the room in a way that made her chest tight and her thoughts scatter. "What is your name?" he said, quieter now. "Olivia. Olivia Ashworth." "I'm so sorry, Ashworth." He said it the way you might repeat a word in a language you'd forgotten you knew. The pause stretched. Olivia's heart hammered so loudly she was certain he could hear it, certain that whatever wolves could smell on a person, fear was surely the loudest of it. And under the fear, mortifyingly, something else, the memory of water on his skin, the low involuntary awareness of how close he was standing, how the steam still curled off him into the cold night air of the room. She didn't wait to see what his face would do next. She mumbled something that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite a goodbye, ducked past him, and fled the room the way she imagined prey fled, blindly, without dignity, caring only about the distance growing between her and the thing that had almost, for reasons she could not name, felt like danger and shelter at once. She did not stop running until she reached the base of the correct staircase, chest heaving, and even then she stood there a long moment with her back against the cold stone wall, replaying it, hating herself for replaying it, and understanding with a sinking, resigned certainty that she had just made the worst first impression a person could make at Northgate Academy, and that somehow, despite everything, it was already too late to simply forget it had happened. Somewhere above her, 4 floors up, Caleb Thornwood stood alone in his ruined quiet, staring at the door she'd fled through, trying and failing to explain to himself why the scent of an unranked girl from the Western settlement had just gone straight through him like something he recognized from 100 years before either of them had been born. Chapter 2. What the Nose Remembers. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Olivia had convinced herself that the previous night had simply not happened, or that if it had happened, it would be forgotten by everyone involved, filed away as one embarrassing footnote among thousands of first-night stories at an academy this size. She was wrong within the hour. The dining hall at Northgate was arranged, like everything else, by rank, long tables radiating outward from a raised dais where the Alpha's family and their circle ate apart from everyone else, close enough to be seen, far enough to never be approached. Olivia took her tray to the farthest table, where the other low-ranked students clustered together with the particular solidarity of people who understood exactly where they stood. It was there she met Ren. "You're the girl who got lost on the west stair," Ren said, sliding onto the bench across from her without asking, sharp-eyed and red-haired, and entirely unbothered by the fact that they had never spoken before in their lives. Words already halfway round the school. "They're saying you walked in on Caleb Thornwood fresh out of the bath." Olivia's stomach dropped somewhere near the floor. How does anyone already know that? Because nothing happens at this academy that doesn't get chewed over by breakfast the next day, and because half the manor staff on his floor are somebody's cousin or somebody's informant. Ren said this with the weary patience of someone explaining a rule of nature. "Don't worry. Nobody thinks you did it on purpose. Everybody who's ever taken the west stair on their first night has ended up somewhere they shouldn't. It's practically tradition. You're just the first one in 3 years unlucky enough to end up there." "Great," Olivia muttered. "So I'm memorable." "You are always going to be memorable," Ren said, not unkindly. "Low rank, no mother, father with no standing in council. People here decide what they think of you in the first week and spend the rest of the year proving themselves right. Best thing you can do is give them as little to work with as possible." She glanced across the hall, to the dais, where Olivia followed her gaze without meaning to. Caleb Thornwood sat at the center of the high table, dark-haired, unreadable, flanked on one side by a golden-haired young woman whose posture alone announced her rank before anyone said a word, and on the other by a lean, watchful young man with a scar through one eyebrow who seemed to be perpetually amused by something only he could see. "Isolde Vane," Ren said, following her stare without needing to be asked. "Highest-ranked girl in the year, and the council's already halfway to announcing her betrothal to Caleb. Her family and his have been circling each other for 2 generations, ever since the old war settled. Don't cross her. She collects grudges like other people collect books." "And him?" Olivia asked, meaning the young man with the scarred eyebrow, though she was aware, distantly, that she was avoiding a different question entirely. "Damien Ashcombe, Caleb's oldest friend, and second in the rankings behind him. They grew up together, trained together. Half the school thinks they'll run the whole Northern Pack side by side one day. Ren considered the word. "Careful. Watch what he says twice as much as what he does." As if summoned by his own name, Damien's gaze drifted down the length of the hall and landed, with unhurried curiosity, directly on Olivia. He did not look away when she noticed him looking. Neither, a moment later, did Caleb, whose head turned as though someone had spoken his name, dark eyes finding her across the crowded room with an expression she could not read and did not trust herself to try. Isolde noticed both of them noticing. Olivia looked down at her tray and did not look up again for the rest of the meal. The rest of the hall carried on around her in its ordinary, merciless rhythm. The clatter of trays, the low competitive murmur of students already comparing family names and old alliances, the particular music of a room built entirely out of hierarchy. Ren kept up a running commentary beside her, half gossip and half survival guide, pointing out which instructors could be bribed with flattery and which could not be moved by anything short of results, which corridors emptied out fastest after curfew, and which were watched by prefects loyal to one house or another. It was, Olivia would realize gratefully over the following weeks, the single most useful conversation she had all year, delivered in the offhand, unbothered tone of someone who had simply decided, without asking, that they were friends now. "Why are you telling me all this?" Olivia asked eventually, unable to keep the question in any longer. Ren shrugged, tearing a piece of bread in half. "Because nobody told me my first year, and I spent half of it learning things the hard way that somebody could have just said out loud. Also," she added, glancing sideways with a grin, "you're the most interesting thing to happen to this school in 3 years, and I intend to be standing close enough to say I told you so." Olivia laughed despite herself, the first real laugh she'd managed since stepping off the L carriage, and for a moment the whole vast, watchful hall felt a little less like a proving ground and a little more like a place she might, eventually, learn to survive. The morning bell called the new wolves to the training yards, where a woman with iron-gray hair and forearms like coiled rope stood waiting with the stillness of someone who had broken more students than she had built. This, Ren murmured, was Magister Rhea, mistress of physical instruction, and the surest way to ruin your first week was to give her a reason to remember your name for the wrong things. She did not have to try. Rhea's eyes found her within minutes, cataloging her thin arms, her borrowed training leathers a size too large, the way she flinched at the crack of practice claws against the training posts. "Ashworth," Rhea said, when it came Olivia's turn to run the obstacle line, in a voice pitched to carry to every student watching. "Low rank, unclaimed lineage, and by the look of you, you've never held a blade or thrown a punch in your life. Let's see what the West Settlement sends us these days." Laughter rippled through the yard, quiet but unmistakable, and Olivia felt her face heat with the particular humiliation of being made an example before she'd done anything at all. She ran the line anyway. She was slow. She was clumsy on the balance beam and graceless over the wall, and she heard, unmistakably, Isolde's low laugh among the onlookers, pitched just loud enough to be heard. But when Rhea called for the second exercise, navigation through the false scent maze, where students had to track a hidden marker through overlapping decoy trails laid to confuse a wolf's nose, something shifted. Olivia had grown up in the Western Settlement tracking her father's traplines through forest that offered no mercy and no clear paths, learning early that raw strength meant nothing if you couldn't read the ground beneath it. She moved through the false trails calmly, discarding the obvious scent markers, following instead the settler logic of where a real trail would have to lead given the shape of the land, and she found the marker in a third of the time it took the next fastest student. Rhea did not praise her, but she watched her, afterward, with a flicker of something that was not quite approval and not quite dismissal either, filed away for later. The lessons that followed the physical trials were quieter, held in low stone classrooms warmed by braziers rather than the raw autumn wind of the yard, and Olivia found she preferred them, if only because the highborn students seemed to care less about proving themselves where strength alone couldn't decide the outcome. Scentcraft, taught by an elderly instructor named Master Thale who smelled permanently of dried herbs and old parchment, turned out to be the one subject where Olivia's Western upbringing gave her an unexpected advantage, reading the layered signatures of a forest, distinguishing a true trail from a false one, understanding the particular grammar of scent the way some students understood written words. Pack law and treaty history, by contrast, was recited in such dense, formal language that half the hall spent the lesson fighting sleep, though Olivia found herself listening more closely than most, some old, unnamed instinct telling her that the tangled genealogies and border disputes droned out by the instructor mattered more to her personally than she yet understood. It was in one of these history lessons, weeks before she had any reason to suspect why, that the instructor mentioned in passing the old Greymore line, exiled and extinguished 2 decades past in a border dispute long since settled, and Olivia felt, for reasons she could not explain, A small cold ripple moved through her without any idea yet of why the name should matter to her at all. It was Damien who fell into step beside her as the students broke for water, unhurried, hands in his pockets, watching her with the same lazy curiosity he'd shown at breakfast. "You navigate like someone who's had to," he said. "Most highborn wolves have never had to find anything in their lives. Everything gets handed to them or laid out ahead of time." There was something needling in it, though his tone stayed pleasant. "Careful with that skill, Ashworth. Rhea likes people who are useful. Isolde likes people who are beneath her. You're at risk of becoming interesting to both, which is a worse position than being invisible." Is that a warning or a threat? Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. "Call it a professional courtesy," he said, and walked away before she could ask what he meant by it, leaving her with a distinct, uneasy sense that she had just been sized up by someone deciding, in real time, whether she was worth the trouble of an alliance or the trouble of an enemy. She did not see Caleb again that day. She told herself she was relieved. She was lying and she knew it, and she hated that she knew it. Chapter 3. The Territory Line. For 3 days, Caleb Thornwood did not so much as glance in her direction, and Olivia decided this was for the best, filed the whole incident away as a closed door, and threw herself instead into the business of simply surviving her first week, memorizing corridors, learning which instructors could be trusted and which could not, avoiding Isolde's circle of friends with the low, careful instinct of prey, learning a predator's patrol routes. Then, on the 4th day, during the mid-morning break between lessons, she rounded a corner in the east cloister and nearly collided with him. He stopped her fall with a hand at her elbow, releasing her the instant she'd steadied, as though even that brief contact required some deliberate act of restraint. Up close, in daylight, dressed rather than dripping wet from a bath, he was somehow no less unsettling. The same sharp dark eyes, the same coiled stillness of someone who had never once had to raise his voice to be obeyed. "Ashworth," he said. Just her name, the way he'd said it that first night, testing the shape of it. "Caleb," she said, then flushed, unsure whether an unranked student was even permitted to use his given name without title. "I mean, I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm supposed to call you." "Caleb is fine." A pause. "You've been avoiding me." "You've been avoiding me too," she said, before she could stop herself, and immediately wanted to sink into the floor. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face and vanished before it fully arrived. "I have," he agreed. It seemed the responsible thing to do. He studied her a moment longer, the same searching look he'd given her that first night, as though trying to place a scent against some memory that refused to resolve. "Are you well?" "I did not, that night. I did not frighten you." It was not quite a question, and not quite an apology, but Olivia understood, from the careful way he'd phrased it, that it was the closest thing to both that a person of his rank likely ever offered. "I frightened myself," she admitted. "Trespassing in the Alpha Heir's private wing on my first night isn't exactly the reputation I was hoping to build." "No," he agreed. "Though I find I don't mind it as much as I probably should." He seemed to hear himself say this and stopped, jaw tightening slightly, as though reeling in something that had gotten away from him. "You should go. Isolde's circle takes the east cloister at this hour. It would be better if you weren't seen talking to me." It was, Olivia would realize much later, the first small thing he ever did to protect her, months before either of them had a name for what was growing between them. At the time it only stung, a small clean cut of rejection dressed up as consideration, and she left without another word, telling herself firmly that she did not care. She cared. She spent the rest of the week furious with herself for caring. The Territory Games began the following Saturday, Northgate's version of an athletic tournament, though nothing about it resembled the gentle competitions of a human school. Teams were drawn from across the ranked houses, each assigned a flag bearing their house sigil, hidden somewhere in the deep forest beyond the academy walls, defended by whatever means the teams saw fit short of drawing blood. The winning team was the one who captured a rival flag and returned it intact. It was, everyone agreed, both the most dangerous and the most prestigious event of the autumn term, and reputations made or lost here tended to follow a student for the rest of their years at Northgate. Olivia had not expected to be placed on a team at all, Low-rank students were often left to serve as support, fetching supplies, tending injuries, but a shortage in numbers on the Western dormitory's team put her, along with Ren, into the forest alongside a dozen others she barely knew. The forest at Northgate was not like the woods back home. It pressed close and dark even at midday, thick with the layered scent signatures of decades of students who had run these same trails before them, and within an hour of the game's beginning, Olivia understood that whatever team held a sold vein intended to win by whatever means were technically permitted. They found the Western team's flag within the first hour, using a decoy scent trail so cleverly laid that even Ren, sharp as she was, didn't catch the deception until it was too late. Olivia, following behind at a distance, arrived just in time to see two of Isolde's teammates dragging Ren backward by the arms, laughing, clearly enjoying themselves more than the rules of the game strictly permitted. She didn't think. She simply ran. What happened next, she pieced together only afterward, in fragments, the low snarl that tore out of her own throat, unfamiliar and startling even to her, the moment one of Isolde's teammates turned to intercept her and found himself, inexplicably, sprawled in the leaf litter. Olivia's slight frame no match for his in a fair fight, but her low, furious speed enough to knock him off balance before he understood what was happening. The way Ren wrenched free in the confusion, and the two of them bolted deeper into the trees, breathless, half laughing despite the danger, alive with the particular fierce joy of two underestimated girls who had, for one glorious moment, refused to be prey. They didn't win the flag that day. But when the horn sounded the end of the games and the teams gathered back at the academy walls to be counted, Olivia caught Isolde watching her from across the yard with an expression that had shed its earlier contempt for something colder and far more attentive, the look of someone recalculating a threat they had previously dismissed. She also caught Caleb watching her, from where he stood among the winning team, his own flag captured cleanly and without incident, an expression on his face she could not name and did not trust herself to examine too closely, something that looked, absurdly, like pride. It was Damien who found her afterward, at the edge of the yard, and this time there was no lazy needling in his voice at all. "That was reckless," he said. "And it was also the single most interesting thing anyone's done at these games in 3 years." He considered her with new eyes. "Isolde won't forget that you humiliated one of her house on the field. Watch yourself, Ashworth. And for what it's worth." He paused, something unreadable crossing his face before he scolded away. He watched the whole thing. Every second of it. He didn't say who. He didn't need to. News of the incident spread through the academy faster than the horn that had ended the games, and by the following morning Olivia found herself, for the first time since arriving, the subject of a very different sort of attention. Students she'd never spoken to nodded at her in the corridors. A pair of low-ranked boys from the Eastern dormitory offered, awkwardly, to walk with her to lessons, an offer she suspected had less to do with genuine friendship than with wanting to be seen standing near whatever she had suddenly become. Even Magister Rhea, calling the roll the next morning in the training yard, paused half a beat longer than usual on Olivia's name, something assessing in her flat gray stare that had not been there before. "You're famous," Ren informed her at breakfast, not entirely without satisfaction. "For about a week, probably, until somebody else does something more interesting. Enjoy it while it lasts." "I don't want to be famous," Olivia said. "I want to be left alone. Nobody who knocks a vain loyalist into the dirt in front of the whole school gets left alone," Ren said. "That's just not how this place works. Best you can do now is decide what kind of story people tell about you, because they're going to tell one either way." It was advice Olivia turned over for days afterward, unsure what kind of story she even wanted told. She had not fought back out of any grand design, only out of the raw, unthinking instinct to protect someone she cared about, and it unsettled her faintly that a single moment of instinct had rewritten, apparently permanently, how an entire school perceived her. She thought, more than once in that stretch of days, of her mother, who according to her father's rare and careful stories had possessed exactly that same instinct, a fierce, unglamorous loyalty that cared nothing for rank or consequence, and wondered, without yet having any reason to connect the two, whether it was a thing that could be inherited the way a scent or a bloodline could. Caleb, for his part, made no further move to seek her out in the days that followed, though she caught him, more than once, watching her from across a courtyard or a lesson hall with an expression he schooled away the instant she noticed. It was Damien who closed that distance instead, appearing at her elbow with increasing regularity over the following fortnight, walking her partway to lessons under the thin pretense of discussing Sendcraft assignments, needling her with the same dry humor that had first caught her attention on the training field, until Olivia found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, looking forward to his company in a way she hadn't expected. "You're doing that thing again," she told him one afternoon as they crossed the cloister together, "where you say something clever and then watch to see if I'll laugh before you decide whether you meant it." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Damien said, entirely unconvincingly, and when she laughed anyway, something in his expression flickered warm and pleased before he smoothed it back into its usual careful ease. She did not yet understand what that flicker meant. She would, before long, understand it far too well. Chapter 4. The Whisper Campaign. Isolde Vane did not attack in daylight, and she did not attack with claws. Her weapons, Olivia learned over the following weeks, were subtler and in some ways crueler. A rumor dropped in the right ear, a rigged pairing in a sparring exercise, a quiet word to an instructor who owed Isolde's family a favor. It started small. A missing assignment that Olivia had, in fact, submitted on time, mysteriously absent from the instructor's records. A pack of older students who suddenly found reasons to block her path in the corridors, not quite touching her, close enough to make the point. Whispers that followed her from the dining hall to the training yards, always just quiet enough to deny if confronted. Unclaimed blood. Charity case. The girl who threw herself at the Alpha Heir the first night and hasn't stopped since. That last one stung worst because it was aimed at making her retreat from Caleb entirely, and it very nearly worked. She began arriving late to shared lessons and leaving early, choosing routes through the academy specifically designed to avoid any hallway he might occupy, telling herself she was protecting them both from exactly the kind of scrutiny Isolde was trying to manufacture. Caleb noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything about her now, a fact that unsettled him more than he let anyone see, least of all himself. He found her one evening in the library's lower stacks, an unpopular corner most students avoided because the lamps there burned dim and inconsistent, exactly the kind of quiet, overlooked space Olivia had come to prefer. "You're avoiding me again," he said, without preamble, settling into the chair across from her with the easy authority of someone who had never once doubted his welcome anywhere in this building. "I'm studying," she said, not looking up from her Sendcraft textbook, though she'd read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a word of it. "You're avoiding me because of what Isolde's been saying." It wasn't a question. "I've heard the same things you have, Olivia. The whole academy has." Her head came up at that, cheeks warm. "Then you understand why it's better if we're not seen together." "I understand why Isolde wants it to look that way," he said, something hard entering his voice. "I don't understand why you're helping her." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and for a moment the careful mask he wore in every other corner of the academy slipped, revealing something younger and more uncertain underneath. "I don't care what they say in the halls." "You will care," Olivia said quietly, "when the council starts asking why the Alpha Heir keeps finding excuses to sit with an unranked girl from the Western settlement instead of the woman he's meant to marry." Before he could answer that, one of the lower lamps guttered out entirely, plunging their corner of the stacks into deeper shadow, and for a moment neither of them moved to relight it, both of them aware, in the sudden dark, of exactly how close together they had drawn without quite noticing. Somewhere above them a night bird called once against the tower stones, and the ordinary business of the academy went on outside this small pocket of quiet as though nothing at all had shifted, though something plainly had. "Tell me about her," Olivia said finally, more to break the silence than because she was ready for the answer. "Isolde. What she was like before all of this." Caleb considered the question longer than she expected. "Sharp," he said eventually. "Ambitious in a way our family's always praised in her and rarely praised in me, which I think has cost her more than anyone ever bothered to notice. We were friends, once, when we were young enough that the arrangement between our houses still felt like a game rather than a sentence. I don't think either of us has forgiven the other for what it became instead. That almost sounds like sympathy. It's not, he said, though something in his voice suggested it was, at least in part. That arrangement was made when Isolde and I were children. It was made by our fathers, for reasons that had nothing to do with either of us. That doesn't make it not true. No, he admitted. It doesn't. His fingers, resting on the table near hers, had not moved to close the remaining inch of distance between them, and Olivia found herself absurdly aware of that small unclosed gap, as though it were its own kind of conversation neither of them had agreed to have yet. He was quiet a long moment, turning something over. Tell me something. That night on the West Stair. You said your scent felt familiar to me. Do you know anything about your mother's family? Beyond your father's line? The question caught her off guard, enough that she nearly asked why it mattered, before some old, careful instinct, the same instinct that had kept her quiet about her mother for 9 years, closed her throat around the answer. My mother died when I was 9. My father doesn't talk about her family. I don't even know her maiden name. Something flickered behind Caleb's eyes, quick and troubled, gone before she could read it fully. That's strange, he said carefully. Most families keep records going back centuries, even minor ones. We're not most families, Olivia said, more sharply than she meant to, and Caleb, to his credit, did not push further, though the question clearly did not leave him. He simply sat with her a while longer in the dim lamplight, the two of them working through separate texts in a silence that had stopped, somewhere in the last quarter hour, being uncomfortable at all. It was Ren who put the pieces together first, weeks later, poring over an old genealogical record in the same library stacks out of nothing more than idle curiosity. Ashworth, she said slowly, staring at a faded page. That's not actually your mother's name, is it? I mean, it's your father's name. What are you asking? I'm asking, Ren said, because there's an old entry here for a lineage that got struck from the official pack rolls about 20 years back. Exiled, it says. Territory dispute with a current alpha line. And the family name that got erased, she turned the book so Olivia could see, doesn't match anything in the current records. Which is exactly what happens when someone wants a bloodline forgotten. Olivia stared at the faded ink, an old crest half scratched away by whoever had ordered the record altered, and felt something cold and unfamiliar settle low in her stomach, the first true thread of a mystery she had not known existed until this moment, one that would, before the year was through, append everything she thought she understood about why she had ever been sent to this academy at all. Don't, Ren said quietly, watching her face, go asking around about this. Not yet. Whoever scratched that name out of the rolls did it on purpose, and people who erase things on purpose usually notice when somebody starts trying to read what used to be there. Then what am I supposed to do with it? Sit on it, Ren said. Same as I'm going to. And write to your father, carefully, and see what he says. She closed the old ledger gently, as though it might crumble, and added in a lower voice, whatever this is, Olivia, it's bigger than a mean girl spreading rumors about your mother. I think you might actually be someone, whether you wanted to be or not. The letter Olivia sent home that week was the most carefully worded she had ever written, and the reply that came back 3 weeks later was shorter than she'd hoped and said almost nothing at all, only that her father loved her, that some things were better left in the past, and that she should focus on her studies and let old history stay buried. It was, she understood even before finishing it, not an answer at all, but a wall thrown up in a hurry, and the very carefulness of its evasion told her more than any explanation could have. She did not stop wondering. She simply learned, as Ren had advised, to wonder quietly. Meanwhile, Isolde's campaign continued its slow, patient work, and Olivia found herself, more than once, cornered in ways that never quite crossed the line into anything she could formally report. A locked door between her and a lesson she could not afford to miss, opened again only after she'd been marked late. A borrowed textbook returned with its margins defaced in ink clearly not her own, resulting in a humiliating conversation with an instructor who did not entirely believe her denial. None of it, alone, amounted to much. Together, it formed a slow tightening net, and Olivia understood, with growing unease, that Isolde was not simply cruel by nature but methodical by design, building a case against her one small manufactured incident at a time, the way a hunter lays a dozen small snares rather than a single obvious trap. It was Magister Rhea, of all people, who first pushed back against it, catching one of Isolde's circle attempting to sabotage Olivia's equipment before a physical trial and dismissing the girl from the exercise entirely without ceremony. "I don't care whose daughter you are," Rhea told the girl, flat and final, in front of the assembled year. "In my yard, everyone starts from the same mud." It did nothing to slow Isolde's quieter campaigns beyond the training grounds, but it told Olivia, plainly, that at least one authority in this place judged by something other than bloodline, and she found she was grateful for it in a way that surprised her. Chapter 5. The Lacrosse Field. The Academy's rare concessions to ordinary youth came in small, strange bursts. A single inter-house lacrosse match each autumn, played more for spectacle than sport, the entire student body turning out to watch from the stands while a marching line of palm-adorned attendants worked the crowd into noise. Isolde, predictably, led that line, resplendent in the Northern House colors, and made a visible show of ignoring Olivia entirely from her place at the front. Olivia hadn't planned to attend at all, until Ren physically dragged her to the stands, insisting that missing the one purely fun event of the term on principle was its own kind of defeat. The Western House team lost, in the end, though not before a hard-fought final quarter that had even the reluctant, low-ranked corners of the stands on their feet. Caleb played for the Northern House, fast and precise in a way that made it clear his reputation on the training grounds wasn't inflated for show, and more than once Olivia caught herself watching him instead of the ball, and more than once she caught him glancing toward the stands in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. It was during a break in play that she noticed it, a slight hitch in his stride as he crossed near the sideline, his gaze snagging on hers in the crowd for half a second too long, and Isolde, a few feet away, noticing exactly where his attention had gone. What happened next was fast and deliberate. Isolde, mid-cheer routine, executed a turn that put her shoulder squarely into Olivia's side, sending her stumbling off the low stand railing into the mud below the bleachers, to a ripple of laughter from Isolde's circle of friends. Caleb saw it. Olivia watched his face change from across the field, watched the controlled ease of the game drop away into something sharper, and for one heart-stopping second thought he might actually stop the match entirely to confront it. He didn't. He kept playing, jaw tight, eyes flicking back to the sideline every few seconds until the whistle finally called the match to its close. He found Olivia afterward, mud still drying on her sleeve, in the shadow of the equipment shed where she'd retreated to avoid further attention. "I saw what she did," he said, without preamble, anger banked low and controlled in his voice. "It's fine," Olivia said. "It's just mud." "It's not fine." He crossed his arms, jaw working. "I should have said something. And what would that have accomplished, besides confirming every rumor she's already spreading?" Olivia shook her head. "I don't need you to fight my battles, Caleb. I can survive Isolde Vane without your help." Something in his expression shifted at that, not offense, but a kind of grudging respect. "I believe you," he said. "That doesn't mean I have to like watching it happen." He found Isolde alone in a corridor 2 days later, cornering her. Olivia heard about it only afterward, from Ren, who'd heard it from a friend who'd witnessed the whole thing, not with the cruelty of a jilted suitor defending his secret love, but with the cold, exact authority of a future alpha reminding a subordinate exactly where the lines of his patience sat. "You will not touch her again," he'd said, according to the version that made its way back to Olivia, gripping Isolde's arm just long enough to make his point before releasing her. "Not with your hands, not with your circle, not with a single word passed through the kitchens. Do you understand me?" He never once, in that entire exchange, claimed Olivia as anything more than someone under his protection. He never suggested, publicly, that his feelings toward her were anything but the ordinary concern any decent person might feel watching a fellow student bullied. It would be many weeks yet before either of them said aloud what was actually growing between them, slow and unwilling, and entirely outside their control. But Isolde understood exactly what she had seen, and from that day forward her campaign against Olivia stopped being petty and started being something far more dangerous, a quiet, patient search for a truth that could destroy the girl from the Western settlement more thoroughly than any rumor ever could. She began asking questions about Olivia's mother. The match itself had drawn a crowd larger than Olivia had expected, the whole student body packed into stands strung within Northern House's banners, vendors from the settlement below hawking spiced cider at the edges of the field, younger students who hadn't yet reached their proving year pressed against the fence to watch their elders play. It was, for one strange afternoon, almost possible to forget that Northgate was a place built to rank and sort them, to pretend instead that it was simply a school, ordinary and bright under the autumn sun, full of noise and rivalry that meant nothing more than a game. Olivia had never seen lacrosse played the way the Northern Packs played it, fast and physical in a way that blurred the line between sport and sparring. And she found herself, despite her nerves, swept up in the rhythm of it. The long sticks flashing in the light, the roar of the crowd each time the ball found the net, Wren shouting herself hoarse beside her over some grievance, with the referee's calls. For a little while she forgot to watch Caleb specifically at all, forgot to feel the particular ache of wanting something she had no right to want, and simply enjoyed, the way any ordinary 18-year-old might, the spectacle of a good match on a clear day. It was only in the final quarter, when the Western House mounted an unexpected rally that briefly threatened the Northern side's lead, that she noticed how often Caleb's attention strayed toward the stands between plays, how the Northern captain barked at him twice to keep his head in the game, how each time he found her in the crowd something in his shoulders eased for just a moment before duty pulled his focus back to the field. Isolde noticed it too. She noticed it every time. After the shove that sent Olivia sprawling off the low railing, after the ripple of cruel laughter from the girls around Isolde, it was Wren who reached her first, hauling her up out of the mud with a furious glare aimed at the palm line, and it was Wren, not Olivia, who shouted something sharp enough back at Isolde's circle to draw the attention of a passing prefect. The prefect did nothing more than frown and move the crowd back a pace, the ordinary useless gesture of an authority more interested in avoiding trouble than addressing it, but it was enough, for the moment, to end the confrontation before it could escalate further. Olivia spent the rest of the match at the edge of the crowd, mud drying stiff on her sleeve, watching Caleb's every motion on the field with a new, uncomfortable awareness of how much his attention toward her had already cost her, and how much more it might cost them both before the year was through. Chapter 6. Damien's silence. Damien Ashcombe had spent his entire life standing one careful pace behind Caleb Thornwood, close enough to share in every privilege of his best friend's position, far enough back that no one ever mistook the two of them as equals. It had never troubled him before. He told himself, through most of that autumn, that it did not trouble him now. He told himself a great many things that autumn that were not true. It began, if he was honest with himself, in the rare, unguarded hours before sleep, on the day of the territory games, watching an unranked girl he'd expected to dismiss within a week instead knock a boy twice her size off his feet to save her friend. It deepened somewhere in the weeks after, in the small, unremarkable moments no one else seemed to notice, the sharp, dry humor she deployed only when she thought no one important was listening, the careful, deliberate kindness she showed Wren and the other overlooked students, the stubborn, quiet dignity with which she absorbed every cruelty Isolde's circle aimed at her without ever once becoming cruel in return. He told himself it was simple curiosity. He told himself, later, when curiosity had clearly become something else, that it did not matter, because Caleb had seen her first, and Caleb's claim, unspoken as it remained, took precedence over anything Damien might privately feel. He was not always successful at hiding it. It showed in small ways. In how he made a point of walking beside her after lessons more often than strictly necessary, in how he defended her, sharply and without being asked, when a group of highborn students made the mistake of mocking her within his hearing, in the careful, measured way he watched Caleb watching her, some old ember of rivalry catching light in a place he'd thought long since banked to nothing. Caleb noticed before Olivia did. He noticed the exact moment his oldest friend's teasing warmth toward her sharpened into something more careful, more possessive in its quiet way, and it lit something ugly and unfamiliar in his chest that he did not have a name for until Ren, of all people, gave it to him bluntly one evening in the library. "You're jealous," she said, not unkindly, catching him glaring at nothing in particular across the room where Damien and Olivia sat together over a shared assignment, laughing at something he couldn't hear. "It would help everyone involved if you just admitted that to yourself." "I'm not." Caleb started and stopped because the denial wouldn't come. It came to a head 3 weeks later, in the training yard after hours, when Caleb found Damien alone at the edge of the field and said, without any of the careful diplomacy that governed nearly every other interaction of his life, "Stay away from her." Damien's easy half-smile didn't waver, though something colder moved behind his eyes. "That's an interesting order, coming from a man who's engaged to someone else." "That arrangement has nothing to do with this." "It has everything to do with this," Damien said, low and even. "You get to want her in the shadows, Caleb, where it costs you nothing and risks you nothing, while the rest of us are supposed to just stand aside and wait for you to decide what you actually want. That's not fair to her. And frankly, it's not fair to me either." The two of them stood a long moment in silence, old friendship and new rivalry tangled together in a way neither of them fully understood, before Caleb finally said, quieter, "I know it's not fair. I don't know what to do about that yet." "Then figure it out," Damien said, "before someone else does it for you." He turned and left before Caleb could answer, and it was only much later, replaying the exchange, that Caleb realized his oldest friend had never actually promised to stay away. The two of them had grown up in adjoining households, sons of families ranked close enough together that their fathers had encouraged the friendship from the cradle, hoping it would harden, by the time both boys came of age, into the kind of loyalty that made for stable alliances rather than rivalries. It had worked mostly. Damien had spent his whole life content to stand at Caleb's shoulder rather than in his shadow, genuinely fond of his friend in the easy, uncomplicated way of people who had never had real reason to compete for anything that mattered. Olivia was the first thing either of them had ever wanted that could not simply be divided or shared. He found himself, in the days after the confrontation in the training yard, watching his own behavior with a kind of detached unease. Noting the small ways he had begun angling himself toward her without deciding to, the particular attentiveness he brought to conversations with her that he did not bring to anyone else. He told himself, more than once, that it was only that she was interesting, that anyone would find her interesting given the circumstances of her arrival and the quiet steel she'd shown ever since. He knew, even as he told himself this, that it was not the whole truth. It was Ren, sharp as ever, who confronted him about it directly one evening in the corridor outside the Sencraft Hall, catching him watching Olivia and Caleb from a distance with an expression she recognized instantly for what it was. "You know how this ends," she said, without preamble, falling into step beside him. "You know it can only end one way." "I don't know anything of the sort," Damien said, too quickly. "Caleb loves her. Actually loves her. Not just wants her the way half the highborn boys in this school want anyone who tells them no for once. You've seen it same as I have." Ren's voice gentled, just slightly. "I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because you're a decent person underneath all that careful charm, Damien Ashcombe, and decent people deserve to know when they're about to hurt themselves for nothing." Damien said nothing for a long moment, jaw tight, before he finally answered, quiet and honest in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. "I know how it ends," he admitted. "Knowing doesn't seem to be helping much." Ren, to her credit, did not press further. She simply squeezed his arm once, an oddly kind gesture from someone who spent most of her energy being sharp-tongued and unimpressed, and left him alone with a truth he had already known and simply not wanted to say aloud. Chapter 7. The Moonlit Trial. The first full moon of the term brought the Academy's most dangerous tradition, the night run, a sanctioned trial in which students shifted into their wolf forms and were released into the deep forest to navigate a night of tracking, survival, and unofficially, whatever rivalries the daylight hours hadn't yet resolved. Olivia had dreaded it for weeks, less afraid of the shift itself, which came to her as naturally as breathing, than of what an entire night in the dark forest, surrounded by wolves who resented her, might bring. Her fears were not unfounded. The instructors had explained the rules of the night run only in broad strokes the week before. Students would shift at the tree line under supervision, then range freely through a marked section of the deep forest until dawn, tracking a series of hidden trail markers while avoiding the instructors' own patrols, which were permitted to intervene only in genuine emergencies. Beyond that, the run was deliberately unstructured, an exercise in surviving a night among your own yearmates with no adult oversight beyond the far perimeter, and it was precisely that lack of oversight, Ren had warned her more than once, that made the run as much a test of politics as of skill. Every year somebody settles a score during the night run, Ren said grimly, as they waited at the tree line for the signal to shift. Instructors call it an accident every single time, even when everybody knows better. Stay near me. Don't wander off to prove anything to anybody. Olivia had every intention of following that advice. The forest had other plans. She and Ren had barely crossed the tree line before they were separated in the confusion of dozens of shifting bodies, and Olivia found herself alone in unfamiliar terrain with the moon high and cold overhead, every rustle in the underbrush a potential threat. The trees here grew close and ancient, their roots humped up through the forest floor in a way that made even her careful footing treacherous, and more than once she froze entirely at the sound of some larger creature moving through the brush nearby, uncertain whether it was another student, a genuine predator, or simply the wind finding its way through branches never meant to hold still. She fell back, as she always did when frightened, on the discipline her father had drilled into her since childhood. Read the ground, not your fear. Let your nose lead before your ears do. Never run blind. It steadied her enough to keep moving with purpose rather than panic, tracing a careful, widening arc through the trees in search of either Ren's scent trail or one of the trial's hidden markers, and it was this same discipline that let her catch the trap before it caught her. She kept her head, using the same patient, careful reading of the land that had carried her through the false scent maze weeks before, and it was this same skill that saved her when she caught, faint but unmistakable, the scent trail of a trap, a section of forest floor rigged. She realized with cold clarity, not by the academy's instructors, but by student hands, close enough to Isolde's usual scent signature that the intent was impossible to mistake. She was still working out how to circle it safely when a low growl behind her spun her around, heart hammering, only to find not an attacker but Caleb, in his wolf form, dark and huge and unmistakably relieved to have found her. He'd been tracking her for the better part of an hour, she would learn later, ever since catching a whisper of her scent on the wind and recognizing, with the same instinctive certainty that had gripped him that first night on the West Stair, that something about her safety mattered to him more than the rules of the trial technically permitted him to act on. Together, moving with the wordless coordination that came easily to wolves who trusted each other, they skirted the trap and continued deeper into the trial grounds, and it was there, in a small moonlit clearing near the trial's midpoint, that they both shifted back to skin at nearly the same moment, breathless and close and suddenly, unmistakably alone together in a way that neither the West Stair nor the library stacks had ever quite managed. "You could have been hurt," Caleb said, quiet, still catching his breath. "If that trap had caught you." "But it didn't," Olivia said. "Because you found me first. I've been finding excuses to be near you for months," he admitted, the words coming out rougher than he intended, as though he'd been holding them back so long they'd worn a groove on their way out. "I don't know how to stop. I'm not sure I want to anymore." The moonlight caught the water still clinging to his hair from where he'd forded a stream somewhere in the chase, and Olivia thought, absurdly, of that first night, of steam and firelight and the particular terror of wanting something she had no right to want. "Isolde," she started, and he shook his head. I know everything that arrangement means for my family, for the council, for the entire treaty between our two houses. I've known it my whole life." He reached out, slow enough that she could have stepped back, and did not, and let his fingers brush her jaw with a gentleness that undid something in her chest she'd been holding tight for weeks. "I still don't want to stop finding you." She could have said a dozen careful, sensible things. She could have reminded him, again, of everything that stood between them. Rank, treaty, the entire architecture of a world built to keep exactly this from happening. Instead, she closed the small distance left between them, and when he kissed her, slow and searching in a way that carried the whole autumn's worth of careful restraint behind it, she understood, with sudden, dizzying clarity, that whatever this was, it was already far too late to undo. They broke apart before it could become anything more than that, both of them breathless, both of them aware of exactly how much danger a single kiss in a moonlit clearing represented to them both. "This can't happen again," Caleb said, though his hand hadn't left her face. "Not until I know what to do about Isolde. About my father. About all of it." "I know," Olivia said. Neither of them believed, even as they said it, that they would manage to stay away from each other for long. They found their way back to the trial's marked boundary separately, by unspoken agreement, arriving through the tree-line minutes apart so as not to draw attention, and Olivia spent the walk back to the dormitories turning the whole night over in her mind like a stone she couldn't stop touching. She had grown up believing, in the quiet, unglamorous way a person believes something they've never had reason to question, that whatever was between people like Caleb Thornwood and people like her would always be exactly what it had been on the West Stair that first night, a brief, mortifying collision quickly followed by a return to the proper order of things. She had not expected the order of things to bend so completely or so fast around a single kiss in a moonlit clearing. Wren found her at breakfast the next morning, took one look at her face, and set down her spoon with the particular slowness of someone bracing for a story. "Something happened," she said. It was not a question. Olivia told her everything, in a low voice, glancing twice over her shoulder to be sure no one else was near enough to hear. Wren listened without interrupting, her expression cycling through surprise, alarm, and something that might have been reluctant delight, before finally settling on a kind of weary fondness. "You do understand," she said at last, "that you have just made your life immeasurably more complicated." "I'm aware." "Good. Just checking." Wren picked her spoon back up. "For what it's worth, I don't think either of you had much choice in the matter, by the sound of it. That kind of pull doesn't usually ask permission first." She was quiet a moment, turning something over. "You should be careful, all the same. Not because I think it's wrong. Because Isolde's still out there digging at that ledger entry, and if she ever puts your name next to his in the same breath as whatever she's found, it won't just be rumors anymore." Olivia thought of the half-erased crest in the old genealogical record, of her father's careful, evasive letter, of the cold unease that had settled in her stomach the moment she'd first heard the word Greymore spoken aloud in a history lesson. She did not yet know how close those two threads, the growing thing between her and Caleb and the buried thing in her own bloodline, were about to become tangled together. She would know soon enough. Chapter 8. The Second Trial. They did not manage it at all. The weeks that followed the night run were a careful, secret unraveling of every rule either of them had ever been taught to respect. Stolen moments in the library stacks stretched longer. Chance meetings in the corridors stopped being chance. Neither of them spoke of it plainly, and neither of them stopped, and the entire academy, sharp-eyed as it was, began to notice long before either of them was ready to be noticed. Isolde noticed first, and worst. She had spent the autumn digging patiently at the mystery of Olivia's mother, calling in favors from her family's older allies, sending careful letters to distant relatives who kept better records than the official pack rolls preferred to admit existed. What she found, delivered to her in a sealed letter 3 days before the term's second trial, was enough to make even her calculating composure falter for a moment before hardening into something far colder. She did not share it immediately. She waited, patient as a spider, for the moment it would do the most damage. That moment arrived during the second trial, a formal hunt and capture exercise conducted in full view of the assembled council elders, who traveled to Northgate twice a year specifically to observe the year's most promising students. Olivia, to Magister Ria's visible surprise, had spent the intervening months quietly excelling at every exercise that rewarded patience and cunning over raw strength, and by the second trial found herself, against every expectation including her own, ranked among the exercise's top competitors. It was in the moment of her clearest triumph, cornering the trial's final marker ahead of every other competitor, Magister Rhea watching with something that had, by now, shifted fully into grudging respect. That Isolde stepped forward before the assembled council and spoke. "Before this trial concludes," she said, voice carrying clean and clear across the yard, "I think the council should know exactly whose blood is being celebrated here today." The yard went very still. Olivia Ashworth's mother, Isolde continued, was not born in Ashworth at all. She was the last surviving daughter of the old Greymore line, the line exiled from these very lands 20 years ago for its rival claim against the current Alpha House. The line that was supposedly ended entirely. Its blood scattered and its name erased from every pack record by order of the current Alpha himself. The silence that followed was absolute. Olivia felt every eye in the yard turn toward her, felt Caleb go very still where he stood among the trial's judges, felt something vast and unspoken shifting into motion that she did not yet understand. "I don't know what she's talking about," Olivia said, and it was, for once in months of careful concealment, entirely true. But the council elders were already murmuring among themselves, and Magister Aria's sharp eyes had gone distant and calculating, and somewhere at the edge of the yard, Caleb's father, the current Alpha, a broad, gray-templed man whose face had gone the color of old ash the moment Isolde spoke the name Greymore, was already turning to leave the yard with the particular haste of a man who very badly did not want to answer the questions that were about to follow him. Chapter 9. The Name Beneath the Name. The days that followed unraveled faster than Olivia could keep pace with. Her father, summoned to the academy by urgent council order, arrived white-faced and shaking and told her, finally, after 9 years of careful silence, the truth he had spent her entire childhood trying to protect her from. Her mother had indeed been born a Greymore, the last of an old Alpha bloodline that had once held rival claim to these very mountains, a claim settled generations ago by treaty and blood until the current Alpha, Caleb's father, had quietly moved to erase the last of that rival line entirely rather than risk its claim resurfacing. Her mother had escaped that purge only by disappearing entirely, taking her husband's unremarkable name and vanishing into the low ranks of ordinary settlement life, raising her daughter in careful, deliberate obscurity, never once telling her the truth of what she carried, hoping that silence alone would be enough to keep her safe. It had worked until Isolde's careful digging had unraveled it. "That's why he recognized your scent that first night," her father said quietly, unable to meet her eyes. "The old bloodlines carry a kind of memory in them, passed down through scent and instinct even when the history's been erased from paper. Your mother's line and the Thornwood line were bound together once, generations back, before the war that split them apart. It's called a mate thread, an old echo of kinship and belonging that outlives even deliberate erasure." Caleb's instincts knew what his mind couldn't have possibly guessed. Her father's hands had shaken as he spoke, an old man's hands though he was not yet old, worn rough from decades of quiet, unremarkable labor that had never once matched the bloodline running underneath it. "Your mother made me promise," he said, staring at some point past Olivia's shoulder, unable to meet her eyes. "She said if anyone ever learned who she really was, it wouldn't just be her they came for. She wanted you to have an ordinary life, a safe one. I thought," his voice broke, just slightly, "I thought if I never spoke the name, it would stay buried. I was wrong. I'm sorry, Olivia. I should have told you the day she died, so it would never have had the chance to catch you by surprise like this, in front of the whole council." "You were protecting me," Olivia said, and found, even amid the wreckage of the day, that she meant it. "I'm not angry at you. You should be," her father said quietly. "I let you walk into this place with no idea what you were carrying." She did not have an answer for that. Not yet, and the two of them sat together a long while in silence, her father's rough, careful hands wrapped around hers, both of them absorbing the shape of a truth that had waited 20 years to surface and had chosen, of all possible moments, the middle of a council trial to do it. Olivia absorbed this in silence, turning over 9 years of careful secrecy, of a father who had watched her grow up not knowing the danger she carried simply by existing, of a mother who had died still guarding a truth she'd never gotten the chance to explain. Caleb found her that evening in the library stacks, the same quiet corner where so much of what had grown between them had first taken root, and did not bother with careful distance this time. "I didn't know," he said, before she could speak. "I swear to you, I didn't know what my father did to your mother's line. I only just learned it myself from him an hour ago, and it is—" His jaw tightened. "It is the ugliest thing I have ever learned about my own family, and I am ashamed of it in a way I don't have words for yet." "I believe you," Olivia said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. "My father built his entire claim to these lands on the idea that the Greymore line was ended," Caleb said. "That there was no rival blood left to contest anything. If the council believes you're the last of that bloodline, then I'm a threat to everything your family has built," Olivia finished. "I understand. That's not what I was going to say." He crossed the small space between them, took her hands in both of his with a gentleness that belied the storm clearly moving behind his eyes. "I was going to say that my father is afraid of you, and men like my father have always dealt with fear the same way, by trying to erase whatever frightens them. I am not going to let that happen to you the way it happened to your mother." "Caleb." "I mean it," he said, fierce and quiet at once. "Whatever this costs me, the betrothal, the council's favor, all of it. I am done pretending I don't know what I want." They sat together a long while after that, neither speaking, the quiet between them no longer the careful, watchful silence of two people guarding secrets from each other, but something steadier, something built out of the plain fact of choosing to stay. Olivia thought of her mother, a woman she barely remembered beyond the warmth of her voice and the particular way she used to hum while braiding Olivia's hair before bed, and wondered whether she had ever imagined, in the last frightened years of her exile, that her daughter would one day sit in this very fortress with the son of the man who had hunted her, choosing him anyway. "I want to meet her," Caleb said eventually, quiet in the firelight. "Your mother, I know I can't, but I want to know who she was, beyond the name my father tried to erase. I want to understand what he was so afraid of that he thought erasing an entire bloodline was the only answer." "I don't know if I can tell you much," Olivia admitted. "My father kept so little of her. A carved wolf. A few stories. That's mostly what's left." "Then we'll find the rest together," Caleb said, with the quiet certainty of someone used to solving problems by sheer force of will. "Old records, old allies of her line who might still be out there, anyone who remembers what the Greymores actually stood for before my family decided they were a threat worth bearing. You deserve more than a carved wolf and a few stories, Olivia. You deserve to know the whole of what you come from." It was, Olivia would think much later, the moment everything between them stopped being a secret and started being a choice, one that both of them, for the first time, made with their eyes fully open to exactly what it would cost. Chapter 10. What the Blood Remembers. The final night run of the term arrived under a sky scoured clean of cloud, the moon huge and merciless over the mountain, and the entire academy understood, without needing to be told, that whatever happened in the forest that night would settle far more than the ordinary business of student rankings. The council had convened an emergency session to determine what, if anything, should be done about the resurfacing of the Greymore line, and Caleb's father had pressed, quietly and urgently, for the matter to be resolved before the students returned from the run. A resolution, Olivia understood, without being told directly, was likely to mean her quiet, permanent removal from the academy, and very possibly from the Pax lands entirely. She ran that night not to complete the trial, but because Ren, breathless and urgent, had found her an hour before the run began with news gathered from a council aide sympathetic to the Western settlement, that certain of the old, hardline elders intended to use the chaos and cover of the night run to ensure Olivia did not survive it, framing whatever happened to her as a tragic trial accident rather than the deliberate erasure it would actually be. Caleb found her before they came for her, having heard the same warning from a different source entirely, and together with Ren and, unexpectedly, Damien, who arrived at the tree line breathless and grim-faced, declaring without preamble that whatever else was true between the three of them, he was not about to stand by and watch old men murder a girl to bury an inconvenient truth. The four of them moved into the forest together, no longer competitors in a trial, but conspirators in something far more dangerous. The council elders who convened at Northgate twice a year were an intimidating presence, even to students who had nothing to fear from them. A dozen gray-templed men and women representing every major bloodline in the Northern Pax territory, seated on a raised platform at the edge of the trial grounds, watching the year's competitors with a flat, assessing patience of people who had long since stopped being impressed by youthful talent for its own sake. Olivia had spent the morning of the second trial in a state of controlled dread, less afraid of the exercise itself than of being watched so closely by people who held, in a very real sense, the power to decide her future at this academy with a single word passed to the right instructor. She had not expected to excel. She had expected, at best, to survive the day without further humiliation. Instead, moving through the hunt and capture course with the same patient, unhurried logic that had carried her through the false scent maze months before, she found the trial's markers faster than students who could outrun her twice over, read the terrain in ways that made Magister Aria's sharp eyes track her with open, unconcealed interest for the first time all term. It was in the flush of that unexpected triumph, cornering the final marker well ahead of the field, that Isolde chose to speak, and the confrontation, when it came, was not the clean, decisive battle Olivia had half expected. It was messier and more human than that, a handful of the Alpha's oldest, most hardline supporters cornering them in a moonlit hollow deep in the trial grounds, old grudges and older fears spilling out into threats before anyone had fully shifted to fight. It was Caleb who stood between them and Olivia, shifting fully into his wolf form with a snarl that carried every ounce of authority his bloodline had ever held, and it was Damien, to everyone's surprise including his own, who stood beside him rather than behind him, the two of them presenting, for the first time in their lives, as true equals rather than heir and shadow. The hollow where they were finally cornered lay deep enough into the trial grounds that no instructor patrol would reach it quickly, and Olivia understood, watching the old hardliners fan out around them with the calm, unhurried menace of people who believe themselves untouchable, exactly how carefully this had been planned. There were 5 of them, graying wolves who had served the Thornwood line since before Caleb's father held the title of Alpha, men and women who had spent 20 years believing the Greymore threat safely buried, and did not intend to let a single unranked girl undo that peace of mind now. This need not be difficult, one of them said, an old wolf named Counselor Braun whose voice carried the particular gentleness people use right before doing something monstrous. The girl trips in the dark. It happens every year during the night run. No one need ever know it was anything more than misfortune. You'll have to go through all 4 of us first, Caleb said, and there was no uncertainty left in his voice at all, only the flat, absolute authority of a future Alpha drawing a line he intended to hold at any cost. What followed was chaos more than combat, snarling, shoving bodies in the dark, Ren darting low to slash at an ankle, and by Olivia a half-second to scramble clear, Damien meeting Counselor Braun's charge head-on with a ferocity that surprised even himself, Caleb standing immovable at the center of it, taking a blow meant for Olivia across the shoulder, without so much as flinching. It was ugly and frightened, and entirely unlike the clean, choreographed duel students trained for in the yard, 5 months of careful academy discipline dissolving into the raw, desperate scramble of creatures fighting for something that actually mattered. It was Caleb's father who finally arrived to end it, drawn by the commotion, and who found, in the moonlit clearing, his own son standing between a pack of his oldest allies and the girl they intended to erase, and understood, in that single frozen moment, that whatever he had hoped to bury by destroying the Greymore line 20 years ago had already grown roots, too deep to cut away now. He said nothing for a long moment, surveying the wreckage of the clearing, his son's torn sleeve, the old counselor's frozen mid-motion at the sight of their Alpha's face, Olivia standing pale but unbroken at the center of it all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the cold authority Olivia had expected, and instead something worn and old, and, for the first time since she had heard his name spoken, almost human. "Enough," he said. "This ends tonight. All of it." What followed was not simple. The truth came out slowly, painfully, over the weeks that followed, in a series of closed council sessions that Olivia was summoned to attend not as a defendant but, for the first time in her life, as someone whose voice the assembled elders were required to hear. She stood before that same raised platform where she had once watched the trial judges with cold dread, and this time spoke plainly of her mother, of the ordinary, quiet life the two of them had built in the Western settlement, of a truth kept hidden not out of shame but out of fear for exactly the kind of violence that had nearly claimed her in the moonlit hollow. The Alpha's decades-old decision was laid bare before the full council in exhausting, uncomfortable detail. Old letters produced from sealed archives, testimony from aging pack members who had known the Greymore line before its exile, the slow unraveling of a story that had been allowed to calcify into official record for 20 years without anyone daring to question it. Counselor Braun and the others who had cornered them in the hollow were stripped of rank and influence within the month, their households quietly absorbed back into lesser positions, their names, Olivia noted with a complicated feeling she did not examine too closely, erased from prominence in almost exactly the manner they had once tried to erase her mother's. The treaty between the Thornwood and Greymore lines was not restored to what it had been before the exile. There was no way, 20 years on, to simply undo that much history, but it was quietly, carefully reopened rather than resolved by violence a second time, a new document drafted over the winter months that acknowledged, in careful formal language, the wrong done to the Greymore line and granted Olivia, as its last surviving heir, a modest but real standing within the council's proceedings going forward. It was not the throne her bloodline might once have held. It was, Olivia decided, watching her father's cautious pride the day the new treaty was read aloud, enough. Olivia did not reclaim a throne, because there was no throne left to reclaim, only the memory of one, and a bloodline that had spent 20 years surviving in the shadows precisely because it had refused to fight for power at any cost. But she reclaimed her mother's name, spoken aloud in open council for the first time in 2 decades, and she watched Caleb's father, gray, diminished, forced finally to answer for a cruelty he'd spent half his life trying to erase, offer something that was not quite an apology and not quite an amends, but was, perhaps, the beginning of one. The betrothal between Caleb and Isolde dissolved quietly in the aftermath, an arrangement that had always served the council's convenience rather than either party's happiness, and Isolde herself, stripped of the leverage her family had hoped the match would bring, retreated from the school's social circles altogether, her cruelty finally spent against a girl who had refused, at every turn, to be destroyed by it. Damien did not press his own feelings. In the end, though Olivia caught him watching her sometimes still, with something wistful and carefully banked, the ember of what might have been under different circumstances glowing low but never quite extinguished. He remained, in his own careful way, her friend and Caleb's, the three of them bound now by a shared night in a moonlit hollow that none of them would ever fully explain to anyone who hadn't been there. "I meant what I said, that night in the training yard," Damien told her once, weeks later, catching her alone in the library stacks in the last quiet days before the term's end. "About it not being fair, watching him want you from a distance while the rest of us waited. I still believe that. But I've had time to sit with it, and I think," he paused, choosing his words with unusual care, "I think some things aren't about fairness at all. Some things just are what they are, and the only choice left to the rest of us is whether we let that make us bitter or not." "And which one are you choosing?" Olivia asked gently. "Ask me again in a year," Damien said, with a faint, rueful smile that held more honesty in it than any of his usual careful charm. "For now, I'm choosing to still be his friend. And yours, if you'll have me." "I'll always have you," Olivia said, and meant it, and something in his shoulders eased at that, the last of the old tension between them settling, at last, into something that felt like genuine, uncomplicated friendship. Wren, for her part, wasted no time reminding Olivia at every opportunity that she had called the whole thing from the very first week, delivering the observation with such theatrical smugness that even Olivia's private grief over everything the term had cost her could not entirely resist laughing along. "I believe my exact words were, 'You were always going to be memorable,'" Wren said, ticking the point off on her fingers as the two of them packed for the winter recess. "I did not, however, predict an ancient bloodline scandal, a foiled assassination attempt, and the alpha heir falling in love with you inside of one single term. That part one will take full credit for underestimating. You're insufferable, Olivia said, but she was smiling as she said it, and Ren, satisfied, only grinned wider and went back to folding her spare cloak with theatrical care, as though she had personally engineered the entire autumn from behind the scenes. On the last evening of the term, Olivia stood with Caleb at the edge of the same mountain the draft-built carriage had carried her up months before, the fortress lit gold behind them. The whole wide, unknown territory of the future spread dark and glittering beneath the stars. "They'll say we've rewritten the old treaty," Caleb said quietly, his hand finding hers in the cold air. "Two bloodlines that were supposed to stay enemies forever." "Maybe that's exactly what needed rewriting," Olivia said. He turned to face her fully then, the same searching look he'd given her that very first night on the west stair, steam and firelight and startled fury all burned down now to something steadier, something that had survived an entire season of secrets and danger and had come out the other side certain of itself in a way neither of them had been certain of anything before. "Whatever comes next," he said, "I don't want to face it without you." "You won't have to," Olivia said, and when he kissed her this time, slow and sure beneath the wide mountain sky, there was no need left for either of them to look over their shoulder, no treaty or trial or ancient grudge left standing between them that the two of them, together, could not learn to answer. Magister Rhea, in her own gruff way, marked the change too. On the last morning of training before the recess, she called the year's students to the yard one final time, delivered her usual unsparing critique of everyone's progress, and then, almost as an afterthought, added a single line as the students began to disperse. "Ashworth, you started this term the worst prepared wolf I've had in a decade. You're finishing it one of the best trackers in your year. Whatever else happens to you outside my yard, remember that you did that yourself. No bloodline earns you that. Only the work does." It was from a woman who rationed her praise as though it might run out, as close to a blessing as Olivia was ever likely to receive from her, and she carried the words with her long after the yard had emptied. Master Thale, too, sought her out before the recess began, pressing into her hands an old, careful text on scent lineage and mate threads that he claimed, with a dry, knowing smile, had simply turned up in his study and seemed like something she ought to have. "History is not only what gets written down," he told her, when she tried to protest that she couldn't possibly accept something so valuable. "Sometimes it is what a nose remembers when the page has been burned. You would do well to understand both kinds, Miss Ashworth, if you intend to keep company with an alpha son." The western settlement, when Olivia finally returned to it for the winter recess, looked exactly as it always had. The same low houses huddled at the edge of the tree line, the same smoke curling from familiar chimneys, the same quiet, unremarkable rhythm of a place that had never once asked her to be anything more than ordinary. Her father met her at the carriage stop with an embrace that lasted longer than either of them could have managed a season before, and though neither of them spoke of the council hearings or the moonlit hollow or any of the year's harder truths that first evening, something had eased between them that had been tight and careful for 9 long years. She sat with him by the fire that night, the old carved wolf he'd given her before she left turning over and over in her hand, and told him, slowly and without prompting, everything the term had cost her and everything it had given her in return. The west stair and the steam-filled room, Wren's fierce loyalty and Damien's quiet friendship, Isolde's long cold campaign, and the moonlit hollow where it had nearly ended everything, and Caleb, always circling back to Caleb, the particular certainty that had grown between them out of nothing more than a scent recognized across 20 years and 2 broken bloodlines. Her father listened to all of it in silence, and when she finished, he took the small carved wolf gently from her hands, turned it once in the firelight, and pressed it back into her palm. He set the small fire iron down, settled back into his chair with the careful stiffness of a man whose bones had grown old faster than his years, and studied her a long moment in the firelight, as though seeing, for the first time, not the child he'd raised alone but the young woman she had quietly become over a single autumn term. "Your mother would have liked him," he said finally. "Not because of his name or his rank. Because of the way you say his, when you think I'm not paying close enough attention. He smiled, tired and genuine, the first easy smile Olivia had seen on his face in longer than she could remember. She always said the old bloodlines only ever mattered as much as the people carrying them chose to make them matter. I think, watching you this year, she'd have said you proved her right. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall over the western settlement, soft and unhurried, settling on the same low roofs and familiar chimneys that had watched her grow up believing herself ordinary. Olivia rose and stood a while at the window, watching it drift down past the dark tree-line, thinking of the mountain fortress far beyond it, its towers buried now under the same slow snow, waiting out the winter the way it had waited out 3 centuries of winters before this one. She thought of Ren, probably at this very hour arguing cheerfully with her own family back in the eastern settlement about some minor grievance from the term. She thought of Damien, wherever his family's winter estate stood, carrying his careful, hard-won peace with him into the recess. She thought, longest of all, of Caleb, somewhere in that same lit fortress on the mountain, perhaps standing at his own window watching the same snowfall, and found that the thought no longer frightened her the way it once might have. It only made her impatient for spring. Olivia held the small carved wolf tight in her palm and thought of the mountain far above them, its towers dark now against the winter sky, waiting patiently through the cold months for the spring term to call its wolves home again. Whatever waited for her there. The reopened treaty still finding its shape, Isolde's wary, watchful truce, Damien's careful, steady friendship, and Caleb, who had promised, in a moonlit clearing, not to face whatever came next without her. She found, for the first time in 9 long years, that she was not afraid to meet it. The mountain kept its old stones and its old silence, the way mountains always do. But something in the pack below had shifted, quietly, and permanently. The night an unranked girl took the wrong staircase and found, instead of a punishment, the beginning of everything.